Hello there, friend. I'm so glad you've joined me again tonight. Before we set sail into the quiet waters of forgotten history, take just a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps this sleepy little channel stay afloat. And while you're still awake, tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere by the sea? A cozy apartment in the city? A quiet village far from the tides? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Now close your eyes if you haven't already. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Let the waves of the day roll away. Let the past fall softly into silence. Because tonight, we drift back to a time of salt and sail, of wooden hulls and linen rigging, of stars that guided and storms that tested the souls of sailors like no storm you've ever known. This is the story of how medieval sailors survived the wrath of the sea. Not just once, but again and again. Not with engines, radios, or weather reports, but with calloused hands, ancient rituals, the whispers of the wind, and sheer, bone-deep courage. They didn't know when the storm would come, only that it would. And when it did, the ship itself would groan, the ropes would scream, and the men on board would become smaller than they had ever felt. It always began with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but warns. The sea, once humming with ripples and gulls and spray, would go still. The horizon would flatten. The air would grow thick, sticky with anticipation, heavy with something unsaid. A single cloud, dark and low, would appear. Then another. Then a wall of black. No thunder. Not yet. Just the hush before everything breaks. Medieval sailors knew this hush. They'd seen it too many times. Old mariners would spit over the side and say a prayer to the mother below. Others would check the ropes, not because it would save them, but because it was the only thing they could do with their hands. The helmsman would grip the tiller tighter, though the rudder already trembled with unseen force. And then, without music or warning, it began. The sky opened, not with rain, but with wind. Rain came later. First came the voice of the storm, a low moan across the waves, like 1,000 distant choirs groaning in unison. Then a snap as sails caught and strained. Then a scream, not from any man but from the mast, the wood, the very bones of the ship. This was the storm, and they were in her grip. Medieval sailors didn't fight the storm. They survived her. That meant knowing her moods. Listening not just to the wind, but to the way it curled at the edge of the sail. Watching the waves not for their height, but their rhythm. A good sailor could feel the pattern of the sea in his knees. He knew when to lean into the pitch, when to duck, when to brace. The ship became an extension of the body, and every creak was a whisper of what might come next. There were no lifeboats, no flares, no radios to call for help. Only rope, wood, and one another. The youngest sailors, barely more than boys, would be lashed to the rigging to keep from being swept overboard. Older ones, grizzled and already half-sea themselves, would shout orders that could barely be heard over the wind. And yet they survived. Not always, but often enough for the stories to endure. They had tricks. A bucket of sand tossed overboard could tell the wind's turn before the sails showed it. Dried kelp tied to the mast would sag or stretch with pressure, warning of shifts no compass could detect. A cross carved into the deck would be kissed by each sailor before the storm, not out of piety, but memory of those who had done the same and never returned. And when the rain came, it came all at once. Blinding, sharp, thick. It wasn't water, it was punishment. The cold soaked through wool, leather, skin. Fingers lost grip, eyes stung, but no one stopped. You didn't stop in a storm, you endured. There were songs not loud, but murmured. Melodies passed from mouth to mouth, ancient as tide, half prayer, half memory. Mother of salt, take not our breath, leave us bones to walk with yet. Some said the song calmed the storm. Others said it calmed the men. But either way, it was sung. And there were saints, not in cathedrals, but aboard. Sailors whispered to St. Elmo, whose fire danced on mastheads before the lightning struck. If the flame was blue, they would be spared. If it was green, a soul would be taken. When the storm hit hardest, They didn't scream, they watched the color of the fire. That was how you knew who'd been at sea too long. They no longer feared the storm. They watched it, like one watches an old god pass judgment. There were sacrifices, not human but symbolic. A length of rope, a scrap of sail, a silver coin wrapped in wax. These were tossed into the sea as offering. A gift for the mother, they said. Spare the mast, spare the breath, take the coin. Whether it worked, no one knew. But it gave the hands something to do, the RT something to hold. In the thickest hour of the storm, time broke. Seconds became years. A gust could age a man. A crash of wave could change who you were. Sailors said storms spoke truth, that in their roar you heard your name the way death might say it. Some returned from storms silent, not broken, just quieter. Like something had been taken or something had been shown. And yet when the storm passed, as it always did, there was no celebration, only breath, only silence again, but a different kind. The sea would still, the clouds would lift. And the ship, battered but upright, would drift on as if nothing had happened. But everything had. They would mend the sails, patch the wood, dry the ropes. And when they spoke of it, they didn't call it horror, they called it the test. Not all ships passed, but those who did carried a new silence aboard. A silence that smelled of salt, of rain, of something older than God. That silence would stay, tucked in the hull, beside the bilge, behind the eyes. And at night, long after the storm, a sailor might sit by the lantern, hands still, gaze distant. He would not tell you what he saw, but he would hum that same melody, low and slow. Mother of salt, take not our breath, leave us bones to walk with yet. And so they survived. Not by strength, not by defiance, but by listening. By bending. By trusting the ship, the sea, each other. And tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, you are aboard that ship. The storm has passed. The water rocks you gently. The sails are mended. The stars return. Breathe now, deeper, slower. You've survived your own storms. Let them go. Let the sea have them. Let the silence hold you. The sea never forgets. Not the ships that crossed her, not the hands that built them, and certainly not the storms that tested the living and the dead alike. Long before compasses pointed true and charts bore truth, sailors of the medieval world navigated by instinct, by rhythm, by the sighs of the wind and the whispers of the tide. But nothing taught like the storm, and when it came, it didn't come alone. It arrived with memory, with warnings embedded in salt-stiffened wood and rope worn smooth by 100 close calls. To survive a storm at sea was to be changed by it. No man returned ashore as he had left. You could see it in their posture, in the way their eyes didn't blink when lightning flashed, in how they listened more to silence than to speech. The ship was a world unto itself, a floating cathedral of creaking beams, wet canvas, and prayer. Not prayer in words, prayer in motion. Every knot tied was a plea. Every oar pulled was devotion. Every patch of tar smeared onto leaking planks was an offering to the gods of the deep. On land, storms struck with violence. But at sea, they unfolded like epics. First, the low horizon. Then, the change in scent. The air would thicken not with smoke or dust, but with tension. Even the rats aboard grew still. The gulls vanished. The surface of the water, once broken by froth and flight, turned mirror smooth. And that smoothness terrified the old sailors most. It meant the sea was holding its breath, and soon it would exhale. They had rituals, strange ones. Men would wear a single red thread around their left wrist, a reminder not of luck, but of loss. For each friend taken by the sea, another knot. Some men had wrists wrapped in rope, others had only one or two, but all had something to remember. And those threads were never removed. Even in sleep, even in storm, even in death. There were tales, of course, there were tales. The man who shouted into the wind and was answered. The boy who vanished from the crow's nest, only to return with eyes black as pitch. The woman who walked across the sea during the storm's eye, barefoot, carrying a lantern no wind could touch. The stories were not meant to be believed, only felt, only remembered in the marrow when the sails cracked and the bow dipped too low. During storms, even the bravest tied themselves to the mast not for safety, but to stay with the ship no matter what. To be thrown overboard was not to die, it was to vanish, to become part of the sea's memory. And the sea remembered. There were codes. Unspoken rules passed between sailors with nods, with stares, with the tightening of jawlines. You never whistled aboard whistling summoned wind. You never named the wave until it had passed. You never, ever said, safe. That word was a curse, a challenge. The sea did not like to be tempted. Food during storms was almost an afterthought. Hardened bread, salted meat, whatever hadn't gone moldy. But one sailor always carried a lemon. Dried and shriveled though it was, it became a talisman, passed from hand to hand. Pressed to lips before a shift at the helm, its bitterness reminded them they were still alive. Some carried feathers from shorebirds. Some kept bits of dried rosemary tucked into their boots. One man wore a ring made from driftwood. Another stitched a coin into the insea. Day of his shirt payment, should he meet the ferryman sooner than expected. It was in the small things that survival lived. A rope tied just right. A whisper repeated just before the mast snapped. A hand held for half a second longer. These things saved lives, even if they never made it into logs or songs. And the songs, when they came, were low and without melody, more like murmurs than music, words shaped by wind and memory. Bend the mast, but break it not. Tie the breath and twist the thought. Words passed down not to be understood, but to be remembered. The old sailors said the sea didn't speak your language. She spoke rhythm. She spoke memory. She spoke silence. There was a belief that storms had names not given by men, but earned. A storm that took a crew was never spoken of again. A storm that spared them became an old friend. The growler, one would say, and everyone nodded. Or the split tooth. Or the gray lady. These weren't just weather events, they were personalities. Some cruel, some testing, some oddly kind, but all of them respected. You never mocked a storm that let you live. Never. The sailcloth, when soaked, weighed as much as stone. Men climbed anyway, barefoot, hands bleeding, to reef and haul. The rigging became slick and alive, snapping like serpents. One misstep meant a fall not onto deck, but into blackness. And if you fell, no cry, no splash, just absence. The sea didn't boast. She swallowed. Below decks, water pooled fast. Buckets passed hand to hand. Rats screamed. The smell of oil and mildew and old iron grew sharp. Yet the men kept to task, not because they believed they'd win, but because they'd done it before, and might again. They said the storm watched, judged. That those who despaired too early tempted fate, so they worked, breathed, sweated, prayed, if only in motion. And still some were lost. 1 minute there, the next foam. The survivors whispered their names to the sea, then never again. It was not forgetting, it was surrender. The sea took, you gave. That was the balance. That was the deal. And when it was over, if it was over, the sky would not clear quickly. It lingered, gray and sullen, like a beast not fully satisfied. The sea would roll for hours, restless. The wind would shift, then pause, then return like a lover who'd left in rage. And now came an apology. The ship would creak differently, lower, older, as though even the timbers remembered the terror. But above deck, faces emerged. Wet, pale, but alive. Someone would laugh, not loudly, not joyfully, but with relief. A cracked chuckle, a cough, a sound that meant breath. And in that moment, no song was sweeter. The ship was not the same. Nor the crew. They had passed through something. And come back. Changed, hardened, softer, quiet. Always quieter. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Of everything that might have been lost. And everything that remained. The storm had passed, but its echo remained. not in thunder, nor wind, nor rain, but in the joints of the ship and the muscles of the men who had weathered it. In the stillness that followed, there was no relief, only recovery. The sky above remained low and heavy, like a ceiling hung with forgotten cloth. The sea, though calmed, still rolled like something remembering pain. The crew did not cheer, they did not speak. They moved as though underwater, slow and deliberate, gathering lines, inspecting sails, checking each other for wounds not seen in the darkness. Storms in the medieval world left more than broken masts and torn canvas. They left questions unspoken. Who had been swept away? Who had seen something no one else had? What prayers had been whispered with no God listening? The captain stood at the helm, not triumphant, but grateful. His eyes searched the horizon not for land, but for normalcy. A horizon that curved gently, a sky that didn't glower. But such things were earned, and they had not yet earned them. Below deck, water had gathered in corners, soaking through wool and wood alike. The bilge was full. Rats moved cautiously. The cook's stores were half-ruined salt pork sodden, biscuits reduced to pulp. Still, the fire was coaxed back to life, not for warmth, but for normalcy. Hot broth would be passed in wooden cups, and though it tasted of brine and ash, it warmed hands and gave the jaws something to do. No one asked for more. They simply accepted. Above, the ship groaned as it always had, but now each creak was different. The mast had shifted. The main boom now tilted half a degree off true. The sails were patched with uneven hands. But the ship still floated, still moved, still obeyed wind when it came. It was enough. The younger sailors slept where they fell, limbs tangled in ropes or curled against barrels. Their dreams were not gentle. Faces grimaced. Fingers twitched. Names were murmured in tongues not their own. One boy wept silently for an hour without waking. An older hand draped a coat over him and said nothing. Some slept not at all. They stood near the rail and watched the water, not out of fear, but of respect. Storms did not visit only once. They returned, like debts, like omens. The men knew this. They did not ask when the next would come. They only prepared. The storm had taken much, but it had given too. It had proven the ship, shown its bones, revealed what held and what didn't. And the crew, too, had seen themselves laid bare. In the mirror of the sea's fury, they had glimpsed who they were when stripped of pride and plan. They had survived, not because they were strong, but because they were many. Because they trusted the mast to hold, the sail to bend, the rope to answer, and each other to act. These were things you did not learn on calm seas. You only earned them where waves roared and winds screamed. They began repairs, not with haste, but with reverence. Every stitch in canvas, every nail tapped into wood, was a thank you to the vessel that had carried them through. No one cursed the storm. No one blamed the wind. They had seen her face and lived. That was enough. And in the days that followed, stories began. Not told loudly, not told fully, but hinted at. A glance, a shake of the head, a hand mimicking the tilt of the mast as it threatened to crack. These fragments became lore. The next storm would be measured against this one. It's bad, someone might say, but not like the night gale. Worse than the squall of St. Elmo, but better than the widow's breath. Such names came not from imagination, but necessity. You had to name what nearly ended you, to remember it, to respect it, to keep it at bay. The sea, though calmed, still held mystery. Lights danced at the edge of vision. Shadows moved beneath the waves. Birds returned, but in silence. Dolphins swam beside them, and someone whispered, "A good omen." Not a fact, a feeling. Sailors believed in omens the way landfolk believed in doors, not to be questioned, only used. One morning, days after the storm, a rainbow appeared not high above, but low, skimming the sea like a brushstroke. The men stared, unsure if they should speak. Then one laughed. Another spat. The moment passed. But something lifted. Laughter did not return easily, but it did return. Quiet jokes, gentle nudges, a song hummed without realizing. The storm had not broken them. It had simply reminded them of their shape. And so the journey continued. Stars reappeared. The moon grew fat again. Fish were caught, dried, eaten. The ship moved forward, not as it had before, but as something reborn. And every creak of wood, every flap of canvas, every hand on rope spoke the same silent vow. Next time, we'll be ready. Sleep now. Let your breath rise and fall like the sea, slow and steady. You are safe. The storm has passed. The ship holds. The stars return. When a medieval sailor rose before the sun, the ship already spoke. Not with words, but with groans in the timbers, the slap of the tide against the hull, the whisper of the wind filtering through coarse canvas above. His eyes opened, not to alarm or urgency, but to the slow rhythm of life at sea, where time was measured not in minutes, but in tasks, in tides, in turns at the helm. The storm might be days behind them now, but it never left completely. It hung in the air, like the scent of salt or the creak in weary bones. This morning, the sky was dull and pale, the kind of gray that neither promised rain nor sun, just a soft and endless waiting. The deck was slick from dew, and boots slid slightly with every step. But there was comfort in the routine. Nets were checked, sails adjusted, lines coiled neatly into spirals like sleeping serpents. The youngest boy on board, called Finch, though no one remembered why, was already at the prow, scrubbing dried fish scales from the rail with a lump of old cloth. He hummed something wordless and tuneless, the kind of hum born from repetition. Not joy, not sorrow, just being. The cook lit his fire with difficulty, coaxing damp wood with quiet curses and slow, practiced breaths. Smoke curled upward, seeking something to cling to in the damp morning air. Beneath deck, the hold groaned as the cargo shifted barrels of salt cod, stacks of cloth, iron-bound for distant coasts. The rats scurried in the corners, bold now that the storm had passed. One of them sat on a coil of rope and cleaned its whiskers, unconcerned. Sailors passed by without noticing. There were older rituals to tend to. Each man, in his own way, acknowledged the sea. Some knelt, heads low, fingers brushing the wet wood. Some whispered names of those lost not aloud, just in the rhythm of their breath. Some simply stared out into the expanse, blinking slowly, as if trying to see past the water into whatever dream or memory floated just beyond. The sea was calm today, but it was a layered calm, the kind that held echoes. The surface barely rippled, and the sails hung lazily, waiting for purpose. Gulls wheeled above, their cries short and sharp. The kind of sound that reminded you nothing had changed. Not really. The storm had been survived, but the sea was not done. She was never done. Beneath the surface, currents twisted in unseen ways. Sailors could feel them in their teeth, in their temples, in the way the air shifted without wind. The captain emerged with his long coat stiff with salt. He didn't speak much, he never did. He nodded once to the helmsman, once to the sailmaster, and then stood with his hands behind his back, eyes scanning the gray. He did this every morning. Some said he was looking for land. Others said he was looking for a sign. No one asked. To question a captain's gaze was to invite bad luck. They believed in that sort of thing, not blindly, but deeply. They believed in signs and symbols, in patterns and whispers, in the way the sea always told you something if you knew how to listen. There were marks carved into the mast that no one touched. A spiral, a bird, an eye. Carved by hands long dead, remembered by none, respected by all. Even the boy Finch had learned not to run his fingers across them. "They're not for us," the cook once said. "They're for the ship." And the ship somehow remembered. She creaked a certain way in warning. She leaned just slightly left when something loomed in fog. She sang through the ropes before a squall. These were not superstitions. These were truths, learned not from books, but from bruises, from years, from storms that whispered lessons no tongue could hold. And still, the crew moved forward. The day was slow. Nets brought in little, a few thin fish, one with its eye missing, Another that bled oddly. "Not right," one man muttered, and tossed it back. The wind barely stirred, but the men worked. They oiled ropes, checked knots, polished metal that would rust again by dusk. It wasn't about making the ship perfect. It was about respect. You maintained what carried you. Even if it failed, you maintained. A man who let a sail fray was no better than the storm itself. And so the work continued. Quiet, steady, sacred. As the day drew on, clouds gathered, not in threat, but in thought. A soft drizzle came and went, like a breath held and released. Someone sang a line from a song no one remembered. "Bring her round and kiss the foam." He sang, then stopped. That was all. No one asked for more. They didn't need the rest. They knew it already. Below deck, the cargo shifted again. The smell of wet wood and old oil thickened. A barrel leaked brine into the grain. Someone patched it with wax. No words exchanged. Just a nod, an acknowledgement. The storm had passed, but the sea was always speaking, always asking, "Are you ready?" And they were, in their own quiet way. They would not be caught surprised again. They did not fear the next storm. They simply knew it would come. And when it did, they would hold. The ship would hold. The sea would test, and they would answer, as they always had. There was something timeless in the way medieval sailors moved through their days, especially after the sea had shown her fury. The hours no longer passed in neat succession, but folded one into the next like waves upon waves, indistinguishable in their pattern yet subtly unique if one had learned to listen. By the second day of calm, the men had resumed the rhythm they knew better than land, better than sleep. It was not the storm they remembered most, but the stillness that followed it, the hollow quiet that filled every crevice of the deck, that echoed off the inside of their ribs, that settled over the ship like old linen. Hay didn't speak of the storm anymore, not because they had forgotten, but because they carried it differently now, like an old scar under the fabric, not seen but always felt. This was a sacred stillness. It wasn't peace. It was a waiting, a breath not yet exhaled. The sails hung in soft arcs, catching little more than suggestion. The sea beneath rolled lazily, a massive creature dozing in the sun. The sky had broken into that pale blue so specific to high ocean, almost translucent, the color of forgotten silk. A faint breeze came and went, unsure of its intent. It was the kind of day when sailors murmured to the ship itself, not to one another. They walked barefoot, not for comfort, but to better feel the wood, to listen, to know. The youngest boy, Finch, had taken to climbing the ratlines again, watching the sea from higher than he should, dangling one leg carelessly over open water. Below, the sailmaster occasionally barked at him to come down, but without heat. They knew that in days like this, boys needed something to conquer, better the mast than the memories. At mid-morning, the ship passed a floating tree, half submerged, barnacles crusting its limbs. No one said a word, but several men touched fingers to their lips, then to their chests. Signs, old ones. The tree was a gift, or a warning, or perhaps both. Sailors did not try to define such things. They only acknowledged them. They believed in signs not because they explained, but because they reminded. Beneath deck, the carpenter sang while checking beams. His voice was rough and low, more breath than note, but steady. Storm took the sound, left me the wood and the salt underground. No one joined in. It was not that kind of song. Above, the cook had hung damp clothes on a line rigged between two spars. They flapped weakly, not from wind, but memory. A seagull landed on the rail and stared at the crew for a long while before hopping off, uninterested. The men did not shoo it. Every visitor was treated as a sign. Around noon, a strange silence descended, not absence of noise, but something tighter. The breeze halted. The ship paused, not in speed, but in intention. The men looked up, not down, listened, waited. The sea was too calm, the sky too clear. The captain emerged again, hands clasped behind his back, boots loud against the deck. He scanned the horizon, then sniffed the air. Not like a man, but like an animal. He did not speak, but every man aboard understood. They began their preparations, slow and practiced. Lines were tightened, sails adjusted, buckets of water hauled and stowed. Not because of danger, but because of something else. They could feel it. The sea was holding back. The cook muttered about pressure. The sailmaster counted knots that didn't exist. One of the oarsmen stood still for nearly 20 minutes, staring into the water as if it might say something. The ocean said nothing. She waited. At dusk, clouds returned, not thick, not heavy, just present. They settled low like lids over tired eyes. The breeze returned but shifted oddly, curling from an unfamiliar direction. It smelled not of salt, but of moss, of stone, of something older than sea or sky. A few men crossed themselves. Others simply worked faster. The ship groaned differently now, not louder, just lower, as if it remembered something. At night, lanterns were lit not for light, but comfort. Their glow was small and warm and alive. Men gathered loosely near them, not speaking, just sharing the warmth. One man began to tell a story, something about a storm that swallowed a ship and left only a single boot behind. But halfway through, he stopped, and no one asked him to continue. The tale was already known, or perhaps still happening. The night deepened. The stars appeared, but dimly, as though peering through smoke. The sea shimmered with faint phosphorescence, green-white trails flickering like thoughts half-remembered. A few sailors watched the lights with reverence. "Souls," one whispered. "Or memories," said another. Neither was corrected. On this ship, both could be true. When sleep came, it came in waves, not all at once. Some men lay still with eyes wide open. Others curled into corners, lulled by the rhythm of wood against water. The storm was not gone. It had simply changed shape. They knew it would come again, not tomorrow, not perhaps even this voyage, but someday. And when it did, they would face it not with fear, but with the knowledge carved into their hands, their sails, their ship's hull. They would hold again. They would survive again. And afterward, in the hush that followed, they would once more move through these rituals, these silences, these strange half-beliefs that made the sea bearable. They did not need to understand the storm, only to outlast it. By the third day after the storm, the silence on the ship no longer felt like absence, but something sacred. Something shaped by what had been endured and what still waited. The sea had not spoken since, at least not in thunder or waves, but in smaller gestures, a gull that refused to land, a rope that frayed more quickly than it should, the way the water sometimes stilled too suddenly, like a breath caught in the throat. The men did not ignore these signs, they lived by them. In the medieval world, a sailor was less a traveler than a listener, less an explorer than a witness to things that could not be explained and dared not be ignored. They listened with the soles of their feet, with the palms of their hands, with the way their backs bent slightly forward as if bracing for something always just beyond the horizon. That morning the wind returned, but gently, like fingers brushing a drumskin. The sails responded with cautious creaks, the ship adjusting her posture as though waking from a dream. The captain did not speak. He simply stood at the bow, one hand resting on the rail, eyes searching for a change in the color of the water, the shape of the clouds, the mood of the birds. He was not waiting for land. He was waiting for understanding. The sea had many moods, but only the wise dared to name them. The boy Finch had grown quieter, as though something in the storm had aged him slightly. He still climbed, still hummed, but now when he reached the top of the mast, he looked outward, not with delight, but with awe. One of the older sailors watched him and nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition. The boy had crossed something. All sailors did, eventually. The line between surviving and knowing, that was what storms gave, if they did not take. Below deck, the carpenter had carved new shapes into the beams, not out of superstition but memory. A wave, a spiral, a hand open and empty. The men didn't ask what they meant, they already knew. In the hold, barrels had been resecured. Some food had spoiled, but enough remained. A rat drowned in a bucket, and no one removed it for hours. It wasn't oversight. It was deference. Everything that entered the ship, even a rat, became part of its story. And stories had weight. You did not discard them lightly. The sky that day was oddly shaped, not with clouds, but with light. The sun bled through in strips, as though the heavens had been torn and patched again. A few men muttered about bad weather returning. Others simply tightened knots, checked rigging, prepared. Preparation was a form of prayer. In medieval sailing, prayer was rarely spoken. It was done. The cook cleaned the pots 3 times instead of once. The sailmaster rechecked the same rope twice in an hour. The boy sharpened a knife that did not need it. These were prayers. They did not beg for safety. They invited strength. They reminded the sea that they were not afraid, only aware. That night, the sea grew louder, but only in places. As though the wind was speaking in a broken tongue, rising near the stern but falling near the bow. The lanterns flickered but did not go out. The ship leaned slightly starboard for reasons no one could find. Someone said it was the cargo, someone else blamed the tide. But no one truly believed either. The ship moved how she wished. They had all learned that. Sleep came in shifts. No one dozed deeply. Dreams returned strange ones. Of faces underwater, of voices beneath wood, of stars arranged in unnatural shapes. The boy woke up crying but would not say why. The carpenter gave him a piece of carved driftwood to hold. It was shaped like a bird with no eyes. He took it without speaking. When dawn came, it brought mist. Heavy, thick, the kind that crawled rather than floated. The ship moved slowly, each creak magnified. Visibility was poor. Sound became a map. Every drip, every footstep, every breath counted. Men spoke less, but when they did, it was in whispers. The mist was a visitor. You did not shout in its presence. You let it pass on its own time. Somewhere, a bell rang, not theirs, distant, hollow. No one reacted. Not with fear, not with curiosity. They simply noted it. The sea held many echoes, some from other ships, some from the past, some from things that never floated on water at all. You didn't chase echoes. You let them be. The captain made a mark in his ledger, a single line. Fog, twand morning. Bell. That was all. Enough. On land, people recorded facts. At sea, you recorded presence. That evening, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had come. The stars returned, sharp and cold. The men breathed easier, but only a little. Calm was not peace, it was pause. Still, they sang that night. A low song, one with no true melody, just a rhythm meant to match the roll of the ship. It was not a song to be remembered, only sung. A lullaby for the sea, for the sky, for themselves. The ship did not answer, but her timbers creaked in rhythm. That was enough. The boy slept better. The cook smiled once. The captain walked the length of the deck twice, then stood alone at the prow until morning. The storm had passed, but its shadow had not. That was the way of things. You never escaped the sea. You only moved forward, carrying the weight of what she gave and what she took, until the end of the voyage or the end of yourself. And when the next storm came, you would face it with what the last had left you: stronger hands, wiser eyes, and a silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything you had survived. By the 4th day, the sea had returned to something that might have once been called normal, though no sailor would ever dare to use that word aloud. Normal had no place on a ship. Every day was new, every wave was its own thought, every shadow on the horizon a question with no answer. The storm they had survived no longer raged in their ears, but it had left behind changes. Not in the ship it had held strong, but in the men, in the way they walked, in how they leaned slightly even when the deck was flat, in the way their eyes searched the sky with a patience that had not been there before. The storm had left a kind of silence inside them, not empty, but layered. The kind of silence that hummed quietly, like the memory of thunder. Morning came with no ceremony, just gray light, a breeze that circled once before moving on. The boy Finch woke before the others. He did not climb the mast this time. Instead, he walked the deck slowly, as if learning it anew. His fingers traced the railing, rough with salt, and he paused near the carved marks on the mass spirals, birds, the shapes that no one touched. He did not touch them now either, just looked. Then nodded. Just once, as if receiving a message meant only for him. Below, the hold creaked as the carpenter rearranged crates. His movements were slow, almost gentle, as though handling something sacred, not salted meat and coiled ropes. The crew had grown quieter, but it was not fear. It was reverence. Not for the storm, but for having passed through it. They ate little that morning. Hard bread, a sliver of fish, water gone slightly brackish in the cask. No one complained. Hunger was a small thing after what they had known. The captain made his rounds without words. He touched the rail, checked the ropes, adjusted a loose knot with the ease of a man who could do such things in his sleep. When he passed the helm, the helmsman nodded. That was enough. Language on a ship was mostly movement. Words were for land. Around midday, the wind picked up slightly, enough to stir the sails. They filled with a reluctant kind of life, like lungs unsure if they were ready to breathe again. The ship moved, not quickly, but with purpose. The sea ahead lay open, but no one trusted it. Trust was something you unlearned out here. The sea gave and took as it pleased. All you could do was honor it. That meant rituals. Polishing the brass that no longer shone. Coiling ropes into perfect circles even if no one would step there. Washing the deck with buckets of salt water, not because it needed it, but because it felt right. The boy joined in. He scrubbed beside the others, silent, steady, until his hands were raw. When he looked up, the cook handed him a cloth. No words, just the act. The cloth was patched in 3 places, stained. It had cleaned many things before. He used it anyway. As evening came, the clouds gathered again, not in threat, but in memory. They moved low, slow, casting the sea in silver. The lanterns were lit early, their light flickering like thoughts, unsure of themselves. The men moved slower now, not from exhaustion, but from care. Each movement was a choice, each breath a kind of gratitude. They had not died, they had lived. And living required attention. That night, the stars were hidden, but the sea glowed faintly with plankton, stirred by the ship's passage. Trails of green shimmer followed in their wake, like whispers of something too old to name. One sailor watched the lights and began to hum again. A new song, slow and deep. The others listened. Some joined, not with harmony but with presence. It was not a song for the storm, it was a song for the silence that followed. A lullaby for the ship, for each other, for whatever came next. The boy fell asleep near the mast. No one moved him. He had earned his place. The captain watched the sea for hours, unmoving. Somewhere in the night, a wave slapped the hull harder than the rest. No one stirred. They had heard worse. They had become something different, something quieter, something that understood the rhythm of survival. The next day would come, and with it, wind and sun and may be another storm. But for now, the ship held. The sea allowed. And they silent, watchful, worn, kept sailing forward, not seeking land, but carrying memory. That was enough. The 5th day at sea arrived without a sound. No gulls cried overhead. No wind rattled the ropes. No voices broke the hush that hung like fog across the ship's planks. It was the kind of silence sailors feared more than thunder, not for what it was, but for what it might mean. A quiet sea could mean peace, or it could mean breath before another scream. The sea's long inhale before exhale. The men moved slower that morning, their feet light on the deck, their hands cautious as they hauled buckets, checked rigging, whispered to the hull beneath them. The boy Finch did not wake early. He stirred only when the cook rapped a spoon against the iron pot 3 times, 1 for luck, 2 for wakefulness, 3 for memory. That was the way they did it after a storm. Everything had rhythm now. Everything had ritual. The food was unchanged dry, tough, barely warm, but the way it was eaten had shifted. No one gulped. Each mouthful was chewed with attention, not for pleasure, but for grounding. Taste was less important than the act. You ate because you were alive. You chewed because your jaw still worked. You swallowed because the sea had not taken that from you. Above them, the sky was an expanse of colorless gray, no cloud shapes, no definition, just endless, even blankness. The kind that made you feel the curve of the earth beneath you, the kind that made men think too much. The captain did not pace. He stood in one place for nearly an hour, eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. When he opened them, he did not speak, only walked below deck. The crew did not follow. They trusted his silence. Silence was part of command. The carpenter carved again, this time into the inner wall near his bunk. A small wave, a spiral, a line. He never explained the symbols, and no one asked. Some men wrote journals, others told stories. He carved. That was his voice. Finch spent most of the day near the prow, watching the horizon through narrowed eyes. He said nothing. He was not looking for land. He was listening, as they all had learned to do. The sea did not speak with words. She used movement, color, air pressure, the way salt clung heavier on some days than others. By mid-afternoon, the wind returned barely. Enough to ripple a sail. Enough to stir the flags from limpness. Enough to give the men reason to move. They adjusted ropes, trimmed canvas, touched the mast with their palms before pulling. Always that touch. A sailor did not serve a ship. He partnered with her. She needed to feel the hand, to recognize it, to remember. They did not name their ship. She had a name, but it was not spoken aloud. Some things belonged only to the wood, to the waves, to whatever passed beneath the keel. At dusk, the sea changed color, not darkening as the sun set, but shifting hue entirely. From flat silver to something almost green, a deep forest green that glimmered like wet moss. A few sailors looked skyward, then downward, then at each other. No one explained it. The sea did not owe them logic. That night, the fog returned not as dense, but more purposeful. It moved with intent, wrapping itself around the mast, settling into the folds of the sails, clinging to the men's hair. They did not light lanterns. Sometimes, light only made the fog thicker. Instead, they stayed close to one another. Not huddled, just near. The cook brought warm water with herbs fennel, if they still had it, or sea lavender if they didn't. Each man drank slowly. The warmth helped. Not the herbs, not the taste, the warmth. One sailor began to whistle, low and steady. A rhythm meant to keep time, not to entertain. The others listened. Some tapped boots against wood softly. Some breathed with it. Finch hummed a counter-melody. For a moment, the ship felt like a cradle. The storm was distant. The sea was listening. The men remembered what it meant to be human. Sleep came more easily that night. Not deeply, but gently. Like driftwood surrendering to tide. Dreams were clearer now. Less fire, less flood, more faces. Smiling ones. Hands reaching, not to pull under, but to pull home. The ship creaked as she moved. Not in protest, in conversation. She had accepted them again. The next morning came as all mornings did, soft, slow, unexpected. The fog lifted by degrees. The sea was calm, but not empty. Beneath the surface, shapes moved. Fish, perhaps, or stories not ready to surface. The men did not drop nets. They let the sea be. The cook made a stew that smelled of roots and salt. Someone found a scrap of dried apple and passed it around. Just a taste, just to remember. The captain returned above deck and placed one hand on the wheel, even though they were sailing straight. It was his way. He did not steer, he reminded. He bore witness. That afternoon, they passed something in the water. A bundle of wood, cloth, perhaps a crate. No one touched it. They watched as it floated past, then vanished behind them. A gift, a warning, a memory. No one would ever know. But the sea remembered. And the ship sailed on. By the 6th day, the ship had become something other than a vessel. It was a world, a floating rhythm of wood and breath, of quiet rituals and subtle movements, of men who had passed through thunder and were now part of the sea itself. The storm was behind them, yet it clung to their bones, not as fear, but as shape. It had remade them in silence. The way they moved, the way they listened, the way they looked at the sky, all had shifted. The boy Finch no longer asked questions. He did not need answers. He woke at dawn without prompting, stood at the starboard rail, and let the wind press against his cheeks. His eyes followed the waves not as curiosities, but as language. The sea spoke in ripples and currents, and he understood it now not in words, but in knowing. The older sailors did not speak to him as they once did. He was no longer a boy. Not after what they had seen together, not after the silence that followed. The captain spent more time below, reading ledgers that held more than numbers. He marked things with small symbol circles, half lines, X's that did not mean wrong but something remembered. He did not share what they meant. That was not his role. His role was to know. The sea that morning was gentle but uneasy. Waves did not crest. They rolled with uncertain rhythm, as if the ocean herself had not decided which mood she would wear. The sky was pale, sun hidden but not absent. The men worked with precision, adjusting lines that did not need adjusting, checking knots already checked, not because of fear but because of reverence. The ship had brought them through, and so they honored her not in words but in action. The carpenter replaced a board that wasn't broken. The cook scrubbed pots until they shone. The helmsman oiled the tiller though it turned smooth. Every touch was a kind of gratitude. At midday, a cloud bank formed on the horizon, low and wide, stretching like a wall. It was not dark, but it moved with intent. The captain saw it first. He did not call it a storm. He called it weather. That was enough. The men began preparations. Not frantic, not slow, just steady. Sails trimmed, supplies secured, lines doubled, lanterns tested, the ship braced, the men braced, not in fear, in readiness. They did not dread what might come. They had already met the storm once and survived. What came now would be met the same way, with quiet strength, with shared silence, with the understanding that the sea took what it wished and gave only what it chose. By late afternoon, the light changed. Not darker, just different. The air grew thicker, saltier. A gull cried once, then was gone. The water flattened in that strange way that meant tension beneath. The boy stood at the bow, arms crossed, and whispered something no one heard. The carpenter stopped carving. The cook stopped cleaning. The helmsman gripped the wheel with both hands. The captain emerged, coat drawn, eyes focused. No one spoke. The wind arrived in a sudden breath, then paused. A testing gust. The sails flinched, then quiet again. It was a game the sea played, a reminder that she chose the time, that the men were only guests. That evening, the sky turned copper. The sea reflected it. The ship glowed like fire in low light. Every man bathed in amber. Shadows lengthened. Voices hushed. The fog returned in strands, low to the deck, coiling like smoke from unseen flame. The ship moved forward. Not fast, not slow, just forward. Then the rain came. Not harsh, not thunderous, just present. Gentle drops at first, then steadier. The men donned their cloaks. No one complained. The rain was warm, cleansing, not punishment. Memory. A reminder of what had passed. And what could return. That night the crew took turns on watch. Each stood longer than required. No one wanted to sleep too deeply. The dreams had returned, not violent but vivid. The sea inside the mind. The creak of wood. The rush of waves. The silence that followed. The boy dreamed of birds with silver wings. The carpenter dreamed of forests that whispered in salt tongue. The cook saw firelight in wet sand. The captain did not speak of dreams. He never had. When dawn broke, the sky was clear again, as if nothing had happened, as if the sea had only tested them, then stepped back. The ship rolled gently, the ropes dried in morning light. A new gull landed on the mast and watched them without fear. The cook made tea. The men drank in silence. The boy smiled once. It was small, but it was there. The captain logged the night with a single phrase: "Sea still holds her breath." The sea would exhale soon. They all knew it. But for now, they sailed forward. Stronger, quieter, together. The seventh day brought wind again, but it was not the wind of danger. It was playful, uncertain, drifting in effort on the east in small gusts that tugged at the sails and teased the hems of worn cloaks. The sea responded in kind, rising and falling like breath half-held, not threatening, only restless. The ship moved smoothly now, not because the sea had grown kind, but because the men had learned its rhythm. They no longer fought the sway or the tilt. They leaned into it. Their feet adjusted without thought. They had become part of the ship, and the ship had become part of the sea. The boy Finch woke early. He carried no tools, asked no questions. He simply walked the deck, touching the wood as he passed, each beam a name he no longer needed to speak aloud. The crew nodded to him now, not as a child, not as a curiosity, but as one of them, a sailor shaped by storm and silence. The cook was already at his post, humming a tune no one knew, stirring something simple. The smell was comforting, not rich, not sweet, but warm, familiar, steady. The men gathered in quiet, each with a bowl in hand, standing along the edge of the deck, watching the horizon, eating slowly. No one spoke. The storm had changed them, not in the way fire changes wood, turning it to ash, but in the way water smooths stone, not removing, but reshaping. They were still themselves, but softer around the edges, quieter, more aware of each movement, each sound, each breath. The captain emerged later, his face unreadable, his coat newly mended by someone's careful hand. He paused at the bow, looked ahead, then turned and scanned each man. He did not need to speak. His presence was enough. A gull passed overhead. Another followed. Birds meant land, but no one reached for a map. The sea would bring land when it chose. Until then, they would sail. The carpenter had finished a new carving, a circle with a spiral inside. He placed it at the base of the mast without explanation. The boy touched it once, lightly, then walked away. Midday brought a sky of layered clouds, gray upon white upon blue, moving in separate directions, each telling its own story. The wind shifted with them, turning northward, carrying the scent of pine, or perhaps memory. The men adjusted the sails without instruction. Their hands moved as if guided by something deeper than knowledge instinct, honed by days of storm and nights of silence. They did not cheer the good weather. They did not smile at the calmer sea. They remained steady, respectful, careful not to draw the sea's attention more than necessary. Celebration was a land-born habit. At sea, you endured, you worked, you waited. The afternoon passed with small tasks: net repair, rope oiling, bucket patching. Each movement quiet, each tool respected. Even the smallest nail was a part of the whole. The ship depended on everything, and everyone knew it. The boy climbed the mast again, his hands more confident now, his eyes scanning not for danger, but for direction. He pointed once, and the captain nodded. No course correction, no command. Just shared understanding. Below, the cook prepared tea from old herbs and salt water. It tasted like nothing and everything, like the ship itself. That evening, the sea turned gold beneath the sun. Not a brilliant gold, but muted, worn, like a coin passed through many hands. The men stood in silence, watching the light move across the water. One sailor began to hum. The tune was the same as the cook's morning song. Others joined. No lyrics, just sound, just presence. The fog did not return that night. The stars were sharp, too sharp to look at directly for long. The boy counted them aloud, stopping at 43. Though there were many more, no one corrected him. Numbers were not important. Attention was. Sleep came easily, deeply, wrapped in the sound of slow waves and the soft creak of a ship that had survived more than one kind of storm. In dreams, the sea was quiet. In dreams, the ship did not sink or fly or vanish, it simply sailed, steady, endless, calm. Morning broke with lavender light. The wind had stilled again. The sea was glass. The ship drifted. No one rushed to trim the sails. No one stirred the rudder. Stillness was rare, and it was honored. The cook passed bread without crust. The carpenter polished old carvings. The captain wrote in his ledger, one word, peace. It was not a boast. It was a record. The sea had allowed them this moment, and they would not waste it. The boy watched the water for hours, saying nothing. His reflection looked older now, not in years, but in understanding. The ship would sail again. The wind would return. The sea would rise and fall, as it always had. But this moment, this quiet, this light, this breath was theirs. And so they breathed, and so they sailed. On the 8th day, the world became quieter still, as if the sea and sky had agreed upon a pause, a shared breath held between tides. The ship no longer creaked under stress, nor moaned under weight. It floated with the stillness of something ancient and alive, not trapped by gravity, but cradled by it. The boy Finch woke before sunrise and remained beneath the worn canvas tarp he called a blanket. His eyes followed the slow movement of the ship's beams above him, each plank a map, each nail a compass. He had begun to dream in patterned circles within circles, ropes that became rivers, waves shaped like the faces of men he barely remembered. He rose slowly, without urgency, and stepped onto the deck with the ease of someone returning to something rather than leaving something behind. The crew was already awake. They had not gathered, but spread themselves across the ship in a kind of quiet choreography. One man oiled a pulley that didn't squeak. Another wrapped sailcloth into tighter bundles. No orders were given. The ship told them what to do, and they listened. The cook was slicing something dry and brown, possibly root, possibly bark, possibly both. No one asked. When handed a bowl, each man accepted it with a nod and chewed slowly, thoughtfully, not for taste, but for texture, for ritual. The storm was now a ghost among them. It did not speak, but it stood nearby. It watched them coil rope, adjust sails, polish rust. The carpenter had stopped carving, though his fingers twitched with the memory of the knife. Instead, he mended a bench that no one had broken. Finch approached him only once that morning, asking without words for the stone oil. The carpenter handed it over. No questions. The boy used it to rub into the rail where his palms most often rested. The rail responded with a deeper sheen, as if grateful. The captain spent the morning seated near the helm, not steering, not watching, just existing. His presence was enough to keep the ship's heartbeat steady. He did not speak to the crew, nor they to him. They understood the language of stillness. When a breeze finally arrived, it was light and warm, curling around ankles and tugging gently at sleeves. The sails rustled with a whisper, not a song. The ship moved again, not with urgency, but with intent. The sea had chosen a direction, and the ship obeyed. Around midday, the clouds thickened slightly, forming soft bands of gray that layered like wool. Light filtered through them like a memory, pale and golden and heavy with distance. The sea grew darker, but not angry. It reflected the sky not out of mimicry, but out of agreement. The men stood by the rail and watched without expectation. The boy climbed to the lookout perch, where the wood smelled of resin and salt. From there, he could see farther than the others, but he did not shout. He only nodded once, and then remained still. There was nothing to announce. The world was as it should be. Later that day, they passed a cluster of drifting wood remnants of something broken long ago, bleached and hollow. No one pointed. No one touched. The ship slid past silently, not disturbing the wreckage, not honoring it either, just passing by. The men spoke little, a word here, a name there. Laughter came once, sudden and quiet, when the cook dropped a pot that made a sound like a cow. It echoed strangely in the stillness, and even the captain smiled. That was enough. Evening arrived early, as if tired. The sky turned to soot. The sea mirrored it. Lanterns were lit, though they barely held against the thickening dusk. The carpenter lit his own lantern below deck and placed it beside his tools, which he arranged and rearranged with the care of a priest laying out relics. Finch cleaned the helm, even though it was already clean. His fingers followed the grain of the wood as if reading a story only he could see. The men began humming again. A song without a name passed from one breath to the next, more exhalation than melody. The sea listened. The ship rocked slowly. Sleep came before full darkness, and one by one, the men folded into themselves, some near the mast, others beneath tarps, some on benches where tools once sat. The boy fell asleep with his head against a coil of rope. The wind moved through his hair like a mother's hand. Dreams were soft that night. No storms, no waves. Only fields, grass, the sound of wind in leaves that no longer existed. And always, beneath it all, the sound of water, not crashing, but breathing. When dawn came, the ship was still, not becalmed, just resting. The crew rose slowly. No urgency, no alarm. The boy stretched once, then resumed his post by the bow. He did not speak. He did not need to. The ship was alive. The sea was listening. And the silence they carried, weathered, sacred, earned, was the most precious thing of all. By the 9th day, the ship had stopped being a place and had become a presence. It was no longer the sum of its sails and wood, nor the echo of the storm it had survived. It was something else entirely, an extension of the men who lived upon it, a rhythm in wood and wind that pulsed like a slow heartbeat beneath the sky. The crew did not notice the transition. It had happened slowly, in the silent gestures passed from hand to hand, in the shared silences, in the way they moved through the days without marking them. There was no need for dates, no need for names. There was only morning and night, sky and sea, motion and rest. Finch had stopped dreaming. Or perhaps he only dreamed of the ship now, and so no difference could be felt. He woke with the creak of the deck before dawn, and he stayed near the bow, breathing in the salt, watching the world turn from black to gray to gold. The sun no longer rose, it revealed. It lifted the veil on another page of the same endless book. The sailors moved with purpose but without rush. They hauled no cargo, they chased no whale, they fought no war. Yet they were never idle. Their hands remained busy recoiling rope, patching things that did not tear, sharpening blades that did not dull. They worked because it was their language. The storm had taken their voices and returned something softer, a kind of shared stillness. The cook made tea stronger than usual. The men drank it with faces turned to the rising light, each sip a meditation. The carpenter had begun carving again, but his lines were longer now, sweeping, spiral-like. They curled around corners, along door frames, across beams. The boy followed them with his fingers, tracing the edges with reverence. He did not ask what they meant. Meaning was not always spoken. Around midday, a breeze arrived, playful and fragrant, hinting at land far off. The sails responded first, lifting slightly, fluttering like breath against skin. The ship shivered not from cold, but from attention. She was ready to move again. The captain gave no command. He stepped to the wheel, placed one hand upon it, and waited. That was all. The sea responded. The ship turned gently, like a creature waking from dream. The water parted without resistance. The wake behind them was straight, unbroken, precise. The men adjusted their stations without signal. The helmsman returned to the rail. The boy watched the horizon without blinking. The carpenter sheathed his blade and tied it twice. Everything had become deliberate, even silence. That afternoon, they passed a bird floating upon the water. It did not fly. It did not move. Just drifted, as if it had forgotten how to do anything else. The men watched it without speaking. It drifted past, and they let it. Sometimes that was all you could do. The clouds above had thickened, not with storm, but with presence. They sat heavy, not threatening. The light beneath them turned yellow, then copper, then a soft, strange blue. The ship glowed like old bronze. A sailor tied a small piece of cloth to the mast. It fluttered once, then stilled. No one asked why. The ship knew, the sea knew, the men need not know everything. As evening drew close, a sound came across the water. A deep, low tone, not thunder, not animal. Just a sound, stretched and ancient, like a horn calling from another world. The men froze, then relaxed. The sea sometimes sang back. The sound faded. The fog returned. This time, it came low, almost crawling across the surface. A silver skin on black water. The boy reached down once, let his fingertips skim the surface. It was warmer than he expected. He said nothing. That night, they lit no lanterns. The stars were enough. The constellations had shifted since the storm. Or perhaps the men had. Shapes they once knew had become new again. The captain watched them for hours, eyes moving slowly, lips unmoving. At some point, he raised one hand to the sky, as if touching a name only he remembered. Below, the cook handed out bread softened in seawater and herbs. It tasted like home, though none could say where that was anymore. Finch dreamed again. This time, not of waves or rope, but of a tree standing alone in a field, its branches full of gulls that did not fly. Just sat, just watched. When he woke, he said nothing. But his eyes had changed. Morning brought wind again. Not strong, not fast, just steady. The sails caught it easily. The ship leaned into it like an old dog recognizing a trail. The men stood straighter. Their movements became precise again. The ship knew the way. They only had to follow. Land would come eventually. Or not. The sea owed them nothing. But for now, it allowed them to move, to rest, to remember. The storm had not won. The silence had not broken them. They had become part of something vast and endless, something soft and deep. And so they sailed. The 10th day began without ceremony. No bells, no gulls. No change in the color of the sky. The sea moved in slow, shallow breaths, like a creature that had tired of roaring and settled into watchfulness. The ship drifted in harmony with that breath, rocking gently, creaking only slightly, as if to remind the sailors that it was still alive, still listening, still with them. The wind was thin and high, brushing the tops of the sails but offering little push. It didn't matter. No one was in a hurry. Not anymore. After 10 days at sea, after storms and silence and dreams carved into wood, time had become something strange, elastic, fluid, irrelevant. There was only light and dark, hunger and rest, wakefulness and sleep. The boy Finch rose later than usual, but no one remarked. He emerged from below deck with eyes half closed, hair stuck flat on one side, a quiet yawn stretching from his chest to the edge of his fingers. He made no effort to seem useful. He simply moved to the railing, leaned against it, and stared into the mist. The sea gave back no reflection. The ship moved slowly. There was no need for speed. That morning, the crew moved through tasks with a practiced, quiet grace. A knot was retied, not because it was loose, but because it had become a habit. A canvas flap was rolled tighter, not to shield rain, but because it felt right. The cook prepared a thin soup of onions and something root-like, barely flavored, yet somehow perfect. The captain spent a long time near the stern, one boot resting on the low rail, his hands behind his back. He watched the wake curve behind them like a ribbon, slowly unraveling into the past. The carpenter sat beside a beam he'd carved days before. He traced it now with a piece of coal, adding thin black lines between the grooves, darkening the shapes, not to decorate, but to define. The ship had become a book, and he its quiet author. No one disturbed him. The boy eventually joined the cook, offering his hands without being asked. He chopped slowly, unevenly, and the cook corrected him once with a soft tap, not a word. That was enough. When the wind returned midday, it was different. It did not push or pull. It whispered. It curled under cloaks, lifted hair, carried the scent of moss and something metallic, like stone washed in rain. The sky remained flat, an expanse of blank parchment waiting to be written upon. The sailors paused to feel it, heads tilted slightly, as if hearing music too low to make out, but clear enough to follow. The sails responded too, drawing slightly, flapping just once before holding still. It was not a wind for sailing. It was a wind for remembering. The boy returned to the prow and sat with legs crossed, eyes closed. His lips moved silently. A prayer, maybe, or a recitation, or nothing. The captain gave him space, The men knew better than to ask what others heard on days like these. The sea spoke to each in its own way. Afternoon passed with slow work. A few planks were checked for dampness. The tiller was cleaned. A cloth was hung to dry, though it was not wet. Every movement had a reason, even if the reason was only to move. One sailor began humming, the low drone like the sound of oars deep below the surface. The others picked it up, not in unison, not with harmony, just overlapping tones that filled the air like fog. The cook stopped stirring his pot. He closed his eyes and listened. The ship continued forward, not fast, not slow, just forward, toward nothing, away from everything. That evening, the fog thickened again, not from the sea this time, but from the air itself. It came not with weight, but with hush, as if the sky wanted to speak, but hadn't yet found the words. The men lit no fire. The cook brought out a dried apple and cut it into the thinnest slices. He passed them around one by one. Each man took one, no more. They chewed slowly, silently, like monks taking communion. Finch handed his to the carpenter. The carpenter smiled barely and nodded. That was enough. The night fell early. The sun didn't set. It simply faded behind layers of mist. The stars stayed hidden. The moon was a rumor. The men lay down where they had stood, rolling against sacks and barrels and each other. The boy curled beside a coil of rope and placed one hand upon it. He did not close his eyes for a long time. He stared upward into nothing, as if trying to remember a name he had never known. When sleep came, it was deep and dreamless, like falling into warm water without a bottom. The ship sailed on. The sea listened. The storm waited somewhere else. The 11th day dawned with a silence so complete it felt like fabric stretched across the sky. There was no wind, no bird call, no sound of distant waves, only the soft, rhythmic creak of the ship as it rose and fell upon a CS. Oh, still it mirrored the sky in color and in stillness. The horizon had vanished. Sea and sky were one. The ship did not glide. It hovered, gently, like a thought held too long in the mind. The sailors stirred slowly, as if their bodies had understood the change in atmosphere, before their eyes opened. There was no urgency, no calls, no orders. The morning required nothing from them but presence. The boy Finch was the first to rise, barefoot, quiet, hands tucked into his tunic sleeves. He moved like a shadow across the deck, touching nothing, disturbing nothing. He stood near the mast and looked upward, not expecting to see anything, just acknowledging the vastness. The sky above was not blue or gray, it was colorless, like bone or fog, endless and soft. One by one the men emerged, and one by one they fell into their small morning tasks. The cook boiled water over a low flame, the only sharp sound being the light click of flint against steel. The carpenter wiped dust from carvings that had gathered none. The captain paced the deck slowly, one hand brushing the railing at every third step, a habit developed long before this voyage, and maintained now not for control, but for grounding. No one spoke. The ship itself seemed to prefer it that way. The sails hung slack, heavy with stillness. They did not flutter or tug, they simply waited, like lungs without breath. The water was so calm that the reflection of the hull could be seen below, clear as a painting, the lines of the ship mirrored with such precision that the boy crouched at the edge to see if his face too could be reflected. It was, but in his reflection, he did not smile. He only watched, as if trying to understand something just beyond his reach. Mid-morning passed without change. The crew took turns sanding the mast with old cloth, smoothing it though it was already smooth. The cook peeled a single dried plum and cut it into 6 pieces, each man receiving one without ceremony. The flavor was sharp and sweet, a shock to the tongue after so many days of blandness. One sailor laughed softly at the taste, and the others smiled, but said nothing. The wind did not return. By midday, the stillness had become weight. The sea did not move, but neither did it rest. It felt awake, aware, watching. The boy climbed to the lookout perch again, not to search, but to feel. The height offered a different silence, thinner, clearer, as though the noise of the world had settled beneath the clouds. He He stayed there for hours. Below, the men moved slowly, polishing brass fittings, oiling leather belts, folding and unfolding tarps that had not been used in days. The carpenter began a new carving, this one not on wood, but on a bone found in the galley. He etched it carefully, using a thin needle, the image forming slowly waves, circles, something like a compass, but not quite. When the captain passed him, he paused, looked once, and kept walking. No comment was needed. The afternoon brought a thin veil of mist, not from the water, but from the air itself, descending like a second skin. It clung to their clothes and hair, made the decks slick, turned every surface cool to the touch. The cook lit a lantern not for light, but for warmth, setting it near the base of the mast. The flame danced small and steady, the only movement in a world otherwise stilled. The men gathered around it in turns, holding hands near the glow, then returning to their posts. Finch did not go to the lantern. He remained near the rail, eyes fixed on the flat line where sky should have met sea. He whispered something now and then, but not to anyone. Perhaps to the ship, perhaps to himself. As night approached, the mist thickened and then began to lift. The sea darkened. A single breeze rolled across the water gentle, barely enough to stir hair, but it was enough. The sails shifted slightly, the first movement in hours. The captain raised his head. The helmsman took position without being called. The boy descended from the perch, his face pale but calm. He moved to the stern, placed his hand on the wheel, and then stepped aside for the captain. That was all. The ship began to move again, slowly, smoothly, as if remembering how. The sea did not fight them, it allowed. The stars returned overhead, faint at first, then bolder, as if pulled from hiding by the ship's persistence. No moon, just stars. The men lay down early. They were not tired. They were listening. Each closed their eyes at different times, drifting into sleep like ships departing different ports toward the same destination. The boy curled near the lantern, which had not been extinguished. It glowed still, warm and faithful. The cook left a cup of broth nearby, untouched. When morning came, the lantern was still burning. The 12th day brought no fanfare, no sudden shift in weather, no strange omens scratched into the clouds. It arrived slowly, as all things did now, moving like a tide beneath the skin, a subtle sense of something having changed even if nothing could be seen. The ship rocked gently, as it had for days, but there was a deeper rhythm to it now, something the sailors had begun to feel in their bones rather than notice with their eyes. The sky above was pale and high, with clouds that moved too slowly to measure. The sea matched it, gray and wide and indifferent. The wind was faint, but present, a constant exhale that stirred the sails just enough to keep them from sleeping. The crew awoke quietly, not all at once, but in a sequence as natural as breath. No one called out. No one needed to. The sound of one man's boots on the deck was enough to wake the next. The boy Finch was last to rise, having slept deeply beneath the gentle sway of the hull. When he emerged, his face was unreadable, not tired, not rested, simply there. He moved to his usual place by the railing and leaned on his elbows, staring not at the sea but into it, as though he might find answers waiting beneath the surface. The cook prepared something thin and steaming, with a smell of dried fish and weak herbs. The men accepted their bowls with small nods, each retreating to his own corner of the ship, eating slowly, thoughtfully. No one commented on the taste. That no longer mattered. The captain walked the length of the ship once, then again, pausing only near the stern where the wood had begun to warp slightly from salt and sun. He ran his fingers along the edge of the railing, pressing against the grain as if checking the pulse of something alive. The carpenter spent the morning carving again, this time not on the ship but on a piece of driftwood he'd kept hidden beneath a coil of rope. It had a strange shape to it, curved, hollowed, scarred. He shaped it without sketch or plan, as though the wood itself remembered what it had once been. Finch watched him for a time, then returned to the mast, wrapping a length of line tighter around the base, even though it hadn't loosened. The movement was habitual, meditative. The helmsman adjusted the wheel, though the ship held its course. Around midday, the wind shifted slightly, not in speed or direction, but in tone. It carried a scent of pine, of something living, something rooted. The men noticed but said nothing. Land, perhaps, or memory. The clouds thickened slowly, not darkening, but gathering as if preparing to speak. The sea responded with small ripples, moving in spirals rather than lines, as though chasing something unseen. A gull passed overhead. It did not cry, just flew in a long arc, circling once before disappearing into the mist. The carpenter stopped his carving and looked after it for a long time. The captain saw it too. His eyes narrowed slightly, then relaxed. It meant something. Everything meant something now. That afternoon, the boy descended below deck for the first time in hours. He moved slowly, touching each rung of the ladder with care. He sat in the narrow passage between the storage crates, closed his eyes, and listened. The ship groaned around him, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. A soft, steady rhythm of wood expanding and contracting with the sea's breath. He sat there until the cook came to find him, holding a small tin cup of something hot. The boy drank it without question. It tasted of salt and smoke. The sky dimmed early again. The clouds thickened and layered, each one darker than the last, though no rain came. The air was not heavy. It was expectant. The crew trimmed the sails, tied lines, secured barrels, not because they were told, not because they feared, but because it was what they did. They knew the sea did not ask for permission. It only offered signs. To ignore them was foolish. As night came, the first distant rumble was heard, not thunder, not entirely. A low, rolling sound like mountains shifting far beneath the surface. The men paused, not in fear, but in attention. The boy returned to the deck and looked westward. The clouds there had begun to swirl, not violently, but with slow precision. The captain moved to the wheel. The helmsman stepped back without a word. The carpenter closed his knife and tucked the driftwood beneath his coat. The cook placed the last bowl in the sink and turned down the flame. The wind grew colder, not sharp, not biting, just more serious. It did not whip the sails, it shaped them. The ship leaned slightly into the gusts, adjusting itself with the grace of something alive and experienced. The men stood at their posts. No orders were needed. The sea was changing again. It did not roar. It whispered in a language of deep sound and slow motion. Finch moved to the prow. He placed both hands on the rail and closed his eyes. The first drops came with no warning, soft, heavy, spaced apart. Not rain, but something older, something slower. The deck absorbed them silently. The sails, dampening, grew heavy. The captain adjusted the wheel slightly, enough to angle the ship's face away from the coming gusts. The fog returned, this time rolling low and fast, hugging the water's surface, wrapping around the hull like a shroud. The lanterns were lit not to see, but to anchor. One by one, the men secured themselves, sashes tied, boots braced, hands always within reach of rope or wood. The storm was not yet here, but it was near. They could feel its thoughts. The sea darkened, the sky flattened, and still the ship moved forward. Not toward safety, not toward danger, just forward. The boy whispered something into the wind. A name, maybe, or a prayer. The sea did not answer, but it listened. The 13th day did not begin with light. It began with a sound, low, stretched, almost buried in the hum of the ship's old bones. It was not thunder, not wind, not the creak of rope. It was deeper, like the earth exhaling beneath the sea. The men felt it before they heard it. Their dreams shifted, their breathing slowed. One by one, they stirred, not waking fully, but sensing the approach of something vast. The boy was first to rise, eyes already open when the others began to move. He walked to the deck barefoot, his steps silent against the damp planks. The sky above was charcoal, not black, not gray, but heavy with something unsaid. Clouds moved fast overhead, not in lines but in circles, chasing themselves in slow spirals. The sea was no longer calm. It was deliberate, not angry, but resolute. Waves moved with weight now, with intent. The ship rose and fell with them, groaning not from strain but from memory. It had done this before. It would do this again. The men emerged one by one, silent, alert, calm. They dressed without speaking. They checked lines without command. They tightened buckles and wrapped cloth around their hands and faces. There was no need for orders. The storm had returned not as chaos, but as judgment. The cook did not light a fire. He passed hard bread and dried fruit in small cloth pouches, handed quietly from one to the next. The carpenter secured his tools, wrapped them in oilcloth, tucked them beneath the stairwell. The captain stood at the helm, his hands loose on the wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing to see. The wind came in layers, first low and soft, brushing along the deck like a hand testing for warmth, then stronger, carrying the scent of iron, of salt, of something old. The sails shifted, pulled, trembled. The ship leaned into it, accepting. The rain came next, not fast, not loud, but steady, like fingers tapping a drum in rhythm with the sea's slow chant. It soaked through cloth, into wood, into skin. The men did not flinch. They welcomed it. It meant the sky was listening. The boy moved to the bow, where he always stood, and wrapped a cord around his waist, tying himself gently to the railing. Not fear, habit, trust. A wave hit then larger than the rest. The ship rolled, dipped, groaned. The lantern near the mast fell, its flame extinguished before it touched wood. The men braced. They adjusted. They said nothing. The storm was speaking now, and it would not be interrupted. The clouds dropped lower. The wind screamed, not in anger, but in warning. The rain thickened. The deck became a river. The sails strained. The masts bent. The ship did not break. It danced. Every movement became sacred. A rope pulled too tight could snap. A foot placed wrong could slide. Each hand on wood became a promise. The boy closed his eyes. He mouthed words. Not spells, not scripture, just sound. The sea listened. The ship climbed a swell as tall as a tower, paused at its crest, then fell into silence. The men did not scream. They had no need. The storm was not here to destroy. It was here to remind. The captain spoke once, a single word, lost to the wind, but understood. The helmsman nodded. The ship turned slightly, angling into the waves, not against them. Submission, not defiance. The rain hit harder. The wind whipped faces raw. The deck tilted more, then found balance. The ship moved with grace through madness. The boy's hair blew straight behind him. His hands bled from the rail. He did not let go. The carpenter braced a beam with his back. The cook crawled to secure a crate. The storm howled. The sea rose. The sky opened. And still, the ship moved forward. Not fast, not far, but forward. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time did not exist within the storm. Only breath, only grip, only faith. The ship creaked like a cathedral under strain. The mast sang a high, bending note. The waves crashed like drums. The sails flapped, tore, held, then quiet. Not silence, not yet, but a pause. The rain lessened. The wind shifted. The clouds cracked open slightly. Light, not sun, just light. Enough to see faces again. Enough to breathe. The men slumped, still standing. The boy loosened the rope. The captain stepped away from the wheel. The storm was not gone. It had moved on. It had spoken, and they had listened. The 14th day began with the hush that follows exhaustion. Not the silence of peace, nor the stillness of fear, but the quiet that comes when even the sky has spent its voice. The sea rolled slow and dark beneath the ship, no longer furious, but not yet kind. The planks of the deck were soaked and swollen, the ropes heavy with salt and memory. The men slept where they had fallen, curled near barrels, propped against railings, arms still wrapped around their tools as though afraid they might drift away. The sails hung like tired lungs, slack and limp, bearing the stains of rain and wind. The boy was among the last to wake. though even in sleep his fingers had never unclenched from the rail. His palms were marked red and raw, but he did not notice as he sat up, blinking into the gray morning. There was no sunrise, only a softening of darkness into something less black. The sky above was like ash, smeared with the faintest suggestion of light, as though dawn itself was hesitant to begin again. He stood carefully, each joint protesting, and made his way across the slick boards with the caution of someone learning to walk for the first time. The cook was already up, stirring something thin over a flickering flame that hissed each time a droplet of rain fell into it. The scent of seaweed and bone broth hung low over the deck. The boy accepted a bowl with a small nod and sat against a crate, sipping slowly. The warmth traveled through him like a small candle in a vast cathedral. Around him, the others began to stir, not speaking, just shifting positions, opening eyes, finding footing. The storm had passed, but it had not left them untouched. Their faces were older now, not in years, but in weight. Even the captain moved more slowly, each step considered. He checked the sails, the ropes, the mast. He ran his hand along the edge of the wheel and then stood still for a long time, staring out at nothing. The sea was not calm, but it was listening. The ship moved forward, not with purpose, but with rhythm. A pulse beneath the boards, faint but steady. The carpenter retrieved his driftwood from its hiding place and resumed carving without a word. The lines he drew were different now, longer, deeper, curved like waves. The cook passed another round of broth, and then, as if recalling something important, cut a piece of dried fruit and handed it to the boy. It was sweet, and the boy closed his eyes for a moment while chewing, allowing himself that brief return to something softer. The wind returned by mid-morning, quiet at first, just enough to lift the corners of cloaks, to sway the lanterns still swinging gently from the beams. The sails responded with small sighs, stretching as if waking from uneasy dreams. The men adjusted ropes, trimmed edges, nodded to one another without needing speech. They worked together like fingers on a hand, each knowing its motion without needing direction. By midday, the mist had lifted. The sky, while still colorless, had become less oppressive. The light was diffuse and uncertain, but it was enough. A gull passed overhead. This time it called out once, a single cry that echoed strangely across the water. The boy looked up and followed it with his eyes, until it vanished into the fog behind them. The captain finally spoke, his voice low, hoarse, used sparingly. He gave no orders, only observations. Northwest currents shifting. Rudder still good. Storm's line was wider than expected. The crew nodded. No questions. No opinions, just quiet understanding. The ship had endured. They had endured. But it had taken something they wouldn't speak of, not yet. That afternoon, the boy climbed again to the crow's nest, his hands tender against the rope, his shoulders stiff. From above, the sea looked the same as it had the day before, and the day before that vast, gray, endless. But he knew it had changed. He could feel it in the way the waves moved, in the way the wind paused now and then, as if catching its breath. He stayed up there longer than usual. When he returned, he said nothing, but he sat beside the carpenter and watched him work. The shapes in the wood began to take form, something circular, something spiraling. The cook prepared something thicker that night, using the last of the dried root and some powdered meat. The men sat in a loose circle, each bowl balanced on knee or crate. They ate slowly. They did not talk about the storm. They talked about rope and wind and the time a sail had ripped clean in two on the last voyage. They told stories of mistakes, not triumphs, of repairs, not victories. The boy listened. He smiled once. It was enough. As the sky dimmed again, darker this time, the wind settled. The ship rocked in a gentle pattern, like a cradle in a current. The captain stood at the helm long after the others had gone to rest. He touched the wheel once, then let go. The ship did not need him tonight. It would steer itself. The boy lay beside the mast, eyes open, watching the stars appear one by one. They were faint, flickering, uncertain, but they were there. He whispered a name into the night. Maybe the sea would hear it, maybe not. Either way, he slept. And the ship sailed on. The 15th day unfolded not like a chapter, but like the turning of a page that had long stuck together, its edges softened by time and damp. There was no sound to mark its arrival, only the rhythmic hush of water lapping against the hull and the whisper of wind threading itself gently through the torn edges of sailcloth. The ship did not wake all at once. It stirred slowly, like something ancient and breathing, stretching sinew and beam in concert with the sea's softened mood. The boy rose with the tide, drawn upward by something deeper than morning. He stepped out from beneath the canvas he had used as shelter and stood barefoot at the stern, watching the horizon as though expecting it to change shape under his gaze. The sea was smoother now, though not without motion. Long, rolling waves carried the ship forward with the steady patience of an old friend. The light was silver, diffused through a gauze of mist that refused to burn away. It muted every edge, softened every shadow. The deck, still slick from days of salt and rain, reflected just enough light to make the air feel brighter than it was. One by one, the crew emerged not with the tension of anticipation nor the slackness of peace, but with the careful movements of men reacquainting themselves with the world after a long night of fevered dreams. They said little. The storm was behind them, and yet it clung to their shoulders like a weight not easily shrugged off. The cook boiled water slowly over a coal ember that had somehow survived. He brewed something bitter from roots, and they drank it without question, not for flavor, but for ritual. The carpenter sat cross-legged by the mast, his tools laid out like a priest's implements, each wrapped in cloth, each touched with reverence before being put to work. The piece of driftwood in his lap had become something else entirely. Not a figure, not a shape, but a story. The boy watched him work, and for the first time, the carpenter looked up and held his gaze. Neither spoke. The moment did not require words. The wind, still low and careful, began to rise with the turning of the tide. It carried a different scent now, not just salt and decay, but something new. Earth, perhaps, or memory. The captain took his place at the helm with a slowness that suggested ritual rather than necessity. His hands touched the wood gently, as if it might vanish beneath his fingers. The ship turned slightly westward, following the current rather than the stars. The sky remained heavy with cloud, but the kind of cloud that promised weather, not threat. The sails caught wind and trembled, uncertain at first, then surer. The ship responded in kind. By midday, the crew moved with purpose. Not fast, not loud, but with the quiet focus of those who know every rope by touch, every board by step. They worked without looking at one another, bound together by something more ancient than command. The boy climbed the rigging not to look, but to feel. He hung there for a long time, suspended between sea and sky, letting the wind wrap itself around his ribs like a second skin. Below him, the men mended sail tiers with thread they had soaked in oil. They worked with fingers chapped and swollen, yet every stitch was true. The cook found a small sack of lentils and cooked them with water that still tasted faintly of wood. The meal was simple. It was enough. As the afternoon wore on, the clouds began to part. Not fully, not fast, but like a curtain stirred by breath. Shafts of pale light fell across the deck, illuminating the wet boards with a dull glow. The carpenter stood and held his carving to the sun. It cast a long shadow, and the boy stepped into it, lifting his face to the warmth. Neither smiled, but both breathed a little deeper. That evening, the sea calmed further, and the sky revealed its stars one hesitant spark at a time. The constellations returned slowly, as if uncertain whether they were welcome. The captain stood near the prow, eyes fixed upward. The helmsman joined him. They spoke of tides, of wind lines, of time. But mostly, they said nothing. The boy fell asleep with his hands folded under his head, lying beside the mast like a child beside a familiar tree. The cook sang something under his breath while cleaning a pan. It might have been a lullaby. It might have been a prayer. Either way, it lulled the men to rest. The ship rocked gently, no longer fighting the sea, but carried by it. Somewhere far away, a storm thundered, but it was not theirs. Not anymore. They had passed through the heart of it and emerged, not whole, not unchanged, but still together. The night passed softly, without incident, and in the morning there would be birds again. But tonight, there was only water and wind, and the deep, slow exhale of men who had survived. The 16th day began as a murmur. Not a sound, not a call, but a sensation like a whisper through wood, like the brush of cloth against skin in a room otherwise still. It was the kind of morning that felt like it had been waiting. The ship floated not with direction, but with intent, and the waves beneath it rolled slow, deep and wide, like old breaths from lungs long accustomed to surviving. The sky overhead was not blue, but it was light, a soft, pale gray that bled into the horizon and wrapped the world in something gentle and patient. There were no birds yet, no clouds, no sun, just light, as though the heavens had drawn a curtain not to hide, but to soften. The boy stirred from beneath the coiled ropes near the mast, blinking against the morning that seemed to reach for him before he reached for it. He sat up slowly, brushed salt and dust from his sleeve, and looked out across the water without expectation. He did not look for land anymore. He looked for meaning in motion, in wind, in the tilt of the deck and the shape of the mist. The others were waking now, one by one. The carpenter stretched first, then stood to inspect the rails he had reinforced. The helmsman tested the wheel's movement, not because it needed steering, but because his hands needed to remember its shape. The cook emerged from below with a cup of something warm and murky, the scent of root and brine curling softly through the morning air. The captain was already standing at the stern, his back straight, his eyes calm. He had not slept much, but his mind was quiet. The crew moved with the silence of habit. They did not ask each other questions, for all answers were already known. The storm was past. The days of chaos had rolled away. But what followed was not ease, it was something more complex. It was return, not to comfort, not to what had been, but to awareness. To the slow, rebuilding quiet that comes after a trial. The ship creaked like a whispering cathedral, every board humming in the light. The wind was low, barely enough to push them, but steady. It did not whip or whine, it nudged. The sails caught what little air there was and responded with soft groans of effort. The boy climbed the rigging not for lookout, but for solitude. Up there, above the low cloud and the breathing deck, he sat with his knees tucked close, feeling the sway of the sea beneath his ribs. He no longer counted waves. He listened to the rhythm between them. Below, the carpenter began carving again. The driftwood he worked on had grown smoother, the ridges now deliberate. The boy had noticed that it had begun to resemble a helm, not a steering wheel, but a crown. Not of gold, but of bone, something ancient. The cook scraped the last of the flour from a sack and made flat cakes, baked quickly on a hot piece of iron. The smell brought a pause to the men's work. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was welcome. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, each taste a reminder that they had hands, mouths, memory. The helmsman told a story that afternoon, not one of glory or danger, but of silence. He spoke of a time he'd been lost in fog near the eastern coast, how he'd listened for bells that weren't there, how he'd seen the shape of his own ship and not known it. The men listened, not nodding, not laughing, just listening, because that was what the sea had taught them how to listen. The boy leaned against the mast for most of the day, watching the horizon. There was nothing there, and yet he watched. The captain called out a heading, not loudly, just enough for the helmsman to turn the wheel. The ship angled northwest. No one asked why. No one needed to. As evening drew close, the sky shifted again, shedding its veil of gray for something clearer. The sun, at last, made an appearance, not as a blinding flare, but as a golden smear against the rim of the world. The clouds, scattered and soft, caught its light and glowed as if recalling how to smile. The sea turned gold, then copper, then something darker and fuller. The men stood by the railings, each in his own space, each with his own silence. The boy whispered a song he barely remembered, a lullaby from years ago, from from someone he could no longer name. The carpenter set down his carving and stretched his fingers. The cook cleaned his pot in slow circles. The captain closed his eyes. The ship rocked gently, no longer with struggle, but with rhythm. The stars returned that night in full. They blanketed the sky with pinpricks of ancient fire, and the sea mirrored them, scattering light like spilled salt. The boy lay on the deck and counted them until he lost count, until numbers meant nothing. Only breath, only the creak of wood, only the hush of wind. The men slept well, not deeply, not long, but well. Enough. The ship sailed on. The 17th day arrived not as a moment, but as a presence, thick and quiet, like the deep breath before a question or the pause after an answer. The sea beneath the ship was soft, almost drowsy, as if it too had grown tired of fury. The sky was layered in a pale blue veil, touched faintly by streaks of white that drifted lazily above the horizon like forgotten brushstrokes on a canvas left too long in the sun. The air was warmer now, but not with heat. It was the warmth of a hearth long banked, of stones that had stored the light of previous days and now returned it slowly. The ship moved with the grace of memory, each sway a recollection, each creak a voice murmuring of places past and dangers met. The men woke slowly, not startled, not summoned, but drawn upward by the scent of something simple, boiled oats, perhaps, or dried fruit warmed in a shallow pot. The cook had risen early, and though his fire was small, it was steady. He moved like a man who had made peace with repetition, who found comfort in the slow ritual of heat and steam. The boy sat near him, legs folded, watching the flames with the stillness of someone who understood that sometimes flames were the only thing worth watching. The crew gathered near the fore, not in formation, not with purpose, but with a kind of instinct that had grown among them like moss on old wood, slow, inevitable, unspoken. The captain stood apart, near the helm, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, not to steer, but to remember. His eyes were not on the sea, they were on the sky. The wind that morning was gentle, a low song that slid between sails and skin without asking for attention. It moved the ship just enough to remind them that they were still afloat, that the world beyond the deck still turned, even if slowly. The carpenter had finished his carving the night before, and now he held it in both hands, turning it gently in the light. It was not beautiful in the way statues are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way driftwood is beautiful, shaped by elements, touched by time, worn and real. The boy looked at it once and did not ask what it was. He knew. The rest of the day passed like a slow tide. Tasks were done because they were meant to be done. Ropes were coiled, boards inspected, sails adjusted by inches. No orders were given. They were no longer crew. They were rhythm. The sea was kind, for now. But the kindness of the sea is not the kindness of man. It is not mercy. It is not generosity. It is only the absence of cruelty. And even that, in time, may shift. But for now, it was enough. The boy spent most of the afternoon at the bow, watching the way the water peeled away from the ship's hull in slow curls and foam. He traced patterns in the grain of the wood beside him, not to pass time, but to notice it. The cook prepared a stew from the last of the dried fish, and a handful of herbs that had survived in a damp cloth. The scent filled the ship with something familiar, something old. It reminded the men of places they could no longer name, of kitchens with open windows, of mothers or wives or strangers who once handed them a bowl and said nothing, just waited for them to eat. They ate quietly, sitting on barrels and crates and steps, their hands cupped around wooden bowls, their eyes on nothing in particular. Afterward, some slept, others watched the sky. One man mended a tear in his shirt, the needle moving slowly through the cloth like a boat through still water. As night approached, the sea darkened, not with storm but with shadow. The sky, clear now, began to reveal its stars once more. They emerged not as points, but as whispers, first one, then a few, then a scatter across the heavens like dust shaken from an ancient map. The sea, Apton charted a course using nothing but his hand and the constellations. The helmsman nodded and adjusted the wheel by a finger's width. The ship responded with a sound like breath. That night, no one spoke of destination. No one asked when or where or why. They had learned that the sea answered none of those. It only gave motion and silence and space in which to listen. The boy fell asleep near the stern, curled like a question mark, his hand resting on a coil of rope that still smelled faintly of tar. The stars above him spun slowly, like lanterns held by unseen hands. The carpenter sat awake for a long time, staring at the edge of the ship where sea and sky met. He did not fear it anymore. It was not a border. It was a passage. The ship rocked gently through the night, and in the morning there would be wind again. The 18th day did not begin with light or sound, but with the slow realization that time still moved, that breath still came, that the ship, against all odds, still rocked gently over a sea that had once threatened to consume it. The sky was clear now, not brilliantly or proudly, but with the modest openness of something that had weathered its own storms and survived to be simple again. The stars that had watched them through the night began to fade, retreating slowly into a pale horizon that bled from gray to rose to the faintest gold. The ship groaned once as the tide turned beneath it, not in pain, but in acknowledgement, as though it too remembered the violence of waves and wind and welcomed the quiet with reverence. The boy woke with a sigh, the kind that speaks of dreams not remembered but felt. He sat up, rubbing salt from his eyelashes, and looked to the east where the sun was preparing to rise not with brilliance, but with the patience of something eternal. The crew was already moving, not with urgency, but with the rhythm of men who had grown used to days without plans. Ropes were checked, sails adjusted, the wheel turned a degree north. Not because it had to be, but because it might matter later. The carpenter was the last to rise. His carving finished, he wrapped it in a cloth and placed it carefully in a nook behind a barrel. The boy watched him do it and did not ask what would become of it. Some things were not meant to be explained. The cook had boiled water and left cups near the mast. There was no stew, no bread, only warmth and the faint scent of mint from the last of the dried herbs. The men drank it slowly, not because they were tired, but because they had remembered the value of slowness. The wind returned by midday, steady and sure, a hand at their backs. The sails swelled like lungs rediscovering air, and the ship leaned into the current with the confidence of something that had stopped asking questions. The captain stood at the helm, his coat faded now to the color of driftwood, his face calm. He gave no orders. None were needed. The boys spent the afternoon near the bow, watching the horizon not with expectation, but with respect. It did not offer answers, it offered direction, and sometimes that was enough. As the sun climbed high, its light danced across the water in broken lines and scattered reflections. The sea was still restless, but not cruel. Waves lifted the hull and set it down again with care. The crew worked in short shifts, mending, folding, sharpening, moving. Each task was a reminder that they were alive. The helmsman began humming an old song under his breath. The boy joined in without realizing it. Others followed. No one knew the words anymore, only the melody. It carried across the deck like wind through sails. That evening the clouds returned not with threat, but with purpose. They gathered low and thick, and the air grew cool. The captain ordered the sails tightened, the lanterns checked, the deck cleared of tools. The men moved with quiet efficiency. They had done this before. They would do it again. The rain came after dark, soft at first, then steadier. It was not a storm. It was a cleansing. The ship seemed to welcome it, wood swelling, ropes drinking, sails glistening. The boy stood in it for a while, face upturned, letting the drops trace the lines of his cheeks. He did not speak. No one did. The rain lasted for hours, and in it they slept, not fitfully, not out of exhaustion, but with trust. The ship rocked them gently, the rain a lullaby, the sea a cradle. When morning came, the clouds were gone. The sun broke over the edge of the world like an apology. Birds circled in the distance, real ones this time, not imagined. The boy pointed and the others turned to look. They did not cheer. They did not shout, but they smiled. Because they knew land was near. It might still be days, it might still be uncertain, but it was near. The carpenter unwrapped his carving and held it up to the light. It had changed, not in shape, not in detail, but in meaning. The crew gathered near the stern as the captain lowered the spyglass from his eye. "Coes, Pline," he said simply. "To the west." They nodded. The helmsman turned the wheel. The sails adjusted. The ship responded. That night, the stars were the brightest they had been in weeks. The sky above them was vast and open and clear, and the sea beneath them echoed its shape. The boy did not sleep. He lay on his back, eyes wide, heart quiet. He thought not of the storm nor the silence after, but of the way the ship had moved through both. The way the men had held fast, had stitched, had sung. The way survival had not come from strength, but from stillness, from listening, from trust. The sea, once their enemy, was now only sea again, deep, endless, unknowable, but no longer feared. The ship sailed on, toward land, toward story, toward whatever came next. And in the quiet that followed, nothing was said, because nothing needed to be.